guys, welcome back to my channel. I actually managed to sort of keep my word. This wait isn't as long as the last one. Sorry about that again. I also don't have as many things to talk about this time. Once again, sorry about that last time. So, I actually only have two books to talk about today. They are related. I want to do a little bit of an in-depth review on both of them. The first one is called Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This was released only in the last month or so. And the second is The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. This one was also released this year, but back in about January. I say that they're related, I mean this for thematic reasons, rather than like they're part of the same series or they take place in the same world. They don't. However, I read both of them fairly close together and I picked up a couple themes that I really liked in both of them. Technically, these do count for the 50 book reading challenge. I'm using Darkest Part of the Forest as read a book that was released this year, and I'm reading Uprooted as read a book that scares you, because I didn't think I was going to use it for anything. I thought I was just going to read it and it wasn't going to count for the challenge. And then it was so unsettling that I was still thinking about it like 3 days later, and I was like, you know what? I think that counts. So both of these are young adult fiction. Holly Black I've talked about before on this channel. She wrote Coldest Girl in Cold Town and White Cat, which is the Curse Workers trilogy. I've done videos on both of them. I'll put links down below. This is another standalone, so it is not related to any of her previous books. Uprooted is also a standalone by Naomi Novik. I have talked about her books briefly in my last video. This was the Temeraire series, so it's the Napoleonic Wars with Dragons. Again, Uprooted is completely separate from any of those. It is a standalone work. It is young adult rather than adult fiction, which is the Temeraire books. But I think I'm just gonna get started. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction to the plot of both of them before I talk about what I liked that I saw as themes between the two. I did actually really like both of these books. I'm gonna start with The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. This is a modern day urban fantasy about a girl named Hazel and her brother Ben, who live in this town called Fairfold, somewhere on the eastern seaboard. I don't remember if we know what state it's in, where basically there's this forest and fairies live in it. And everyone knows that fairies live in it. This is just sort of an accepted part of the town. It's like their main tourist attraction. It's very much in the fabric of the town. So if you know anything about the Fae or fairies, you will know that they're not always very kind or nice, or they can sometimes be kind of deadly. So the people in Fairfold know the rules of how to avoid being caught by fairies. You know, things like don't thank them for anything, because then that creates a sense of obligation and they can call in a favor later. You know, don't give up your name, things like that. Things that have been in fairy tales over and over again that are sort of repeated lessons. They know all of these, but then the tourists don't always. And so sometimes the tourists get caught by the fairies, and this is just kind of an accepted thing that happens. You come to Fairfold, you might get caught by the fairies. But the people living in this town have this sort of dual consciousness about the fairies, which is that like the tourists are afraid because they don't know the rules, and then the tourists don't know how bad the fairies can get, because so they're not afraid enough. So there is this real sense of danger to the forest and to the fairies, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking more about later. So the main plot of this book is that there's a boy who is in a coffin. Basically it's sort of a Sleeping Beauty situation. It's a clear coffin, but no one can break it, and no one's been able to wake him up. He's been there longer than anyone can really remember. I don't know if we know exactly how long it's been, but it's definitely longer than anyone currently living in the town can remember. And so Hazel and Ben have had this sort of daydream about this prince where they're both sort of convinced that he is there for them and that they're going to be the ones to free him. And they sort of concocted this story that, you know, he's sort of both of their love interests, because Ben is actually gay. And the plot of the book begins when the coffin is broken and the prince is gone. And it sort of goes from there. There's also a changeling boy named Jack, and his whole family history is actually really interesting. So basically when Carter was a child, Carter is a young boy in the town, he was replaced with a changeling boy who is Jack. But his mother, having grown up in the town, knew instantly that this was a changeling and also how to get her boy back. So the fairy mother appeared, and the mother said, I live in this town, I'm not a tourist, you have no right to take my child, and demanded her child back. So the mother gives her child back, and then she refuses to give up the fairy changeling child because she says, you gave him up, you don't deserve him. And they promise retribution for that, but so far nothing's really happened, and that was about 16 years ago. So she's raised both of them, Carter and Jack. So Carter is the human and Jack is the fairy. And Jack looks exactly like Carter, except that his ears are slightly pointed, and everyone just, again, kind of accepts him and accepts that he's there. And so, again, once the plot begins with the fairy prince, Jack and Hazel and Ben all sort of come together to figure out what's happening. And it turns out that Jack may have stronger ties to the Fae than anyone had possibly previously realized, because everyone's just sort of assumed that he has been raised as human, and therefore, even though he looks slightly non-human, he still effectively is. And it turns out that that might not totally be true. And there's a lot of things where, like, Hazel has this persona of the, like, stalwart knight, and she's going to protect everyone. And her brother have grown up in this household where their parents are these sort of bohemian artists that don't always pay attention to them, and so they were kind of neglected when they were growing up, so they learned to rely on each other. And Ben, her brother, is supernaturally gifted at music, because when their mother was young, she had an encounter with a fairy and sort of accidentally in the conversation expressed a wish that her son would be into art the way that she is. And so the fairy gave Ben a gift slash curse to be supernaturally good at music. And Ben has sort of rejected this because he feels like it's sort of out of his control. He's basically given up music because his music takes people over and it makes them do things that they wouldn't normally do. And so he's very uncomfortable with it, and he's basically rejected this. But so he sort of has this persona of the bard, and she has the persona of the knight. And so they've done a lot of exploring in the woods, and they like found this sword, and it's sort of about them going out and figuring out this mystery about the prince, and also trying to figure out the underlying cause to why the forest and the Fae have been getting more aggressive and more vicious in recent years. So that's darkest part of the forest. Now I want to talk about Uprooted. Uprooted seems stylistically very different because it is not urban fantasy, and it's a retelling basically of Beauty and the Beast. So this is the cover, first of all. This is the US edition. So in Uprooted, the main girl is named Yashka. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. All of the names in this book are very Eastern European, so I apologize in advance for the inevitable mispronunciations that are gonna happen here. So Yashka has been growing up in this small village named Dvernik, which is a small town in a valley that is surrounded, or bordered rather, by this wood, and it's always capitalized because the wood is this malevolent magical force that has the ability to corrupt. So their protection against the wood is a wizard named the Dragon who has lived in this tower. He's powerful and immortal, and every 10 years he brings a girl from one of the 7 villages. 7 villages? Something. Anyway, he gathers all of the 17-year-old girls. This is gonna sound so sketchy. He gathers all the 17-year-old girls from the villages, and then he picks out the most special one, who is special in some way, either prettiest or best dancer, especially kind or something. And he brings that girl to his tower to live with him for 10 years. And the girls always come back, but when they come back, they're somewhat changed. And, you know, this being this kind of society, everyone assumes that they are ruined because they've been living alone with a man for 10 years. All of the girls claim that he never touched them, but they also never really want to stay in the town. There's a line very early in the novel where Yashka's father says they forget how to live here. And so usually they move away from the valley and go like to the city and, you know, open shops, etc. They have lives, but they don't have lives in the town that they grew up anymore. So Yashka, of course, belongs to the age group of girls that could be taken, but everyone has known that the girl that will be taken is her best friend Cassia. Cassia is beautiful, Cassia is kind, Cassia is the best dancer, Cassia is the golden girl of the surrounding villages. And meanwhile, Yashka is clumsy and doesn't seem to have any particular talents, except that she's constantly getting herself dirty. So she's known her whole life that Cassia is going to be taken from her, and Cassia has known her whole life that she is going to be taken from her village and from her home. There's a line about how only people who are traveling from outside of the area will ever compliment Cassia's mother on how beautiful her daughter is, because everyone in the village knows that this is kind of a mournful thing because Cassia is going to be taken away. So of course, because Yashka is the main character, on the actual choosing day, Yashka gets chosen instead of Cassia. Obviously, that was not a surprise. And so part of what I actually really loved about this book was the relationship between Yashka and Cassia, because even when they are separated, their love for each other is so strong and so present, and Cassia is obviously Yashka's like most important person. Even sometimes beyond her parents and the rest of her family, Cassia is the one that she holds the most dear. But because of the way that they've been raised and the way that this system works, there are things that are in the back of their mind. Like, Yashka has always been kind of glad that she's not going to be taken because she doesn't want to be removed from her family, and Cassia kind of resented that she was raised to be given away. And then the fact that they didn't even fulfill what they expected, the way that Yashka was taken and Cassia wasn't, means that Cassia suddenly realizes that she has been raised to be given away, and then she wasn't even worth giving away. And so there's some resentments and jealousies and bitterness, because there's a moment where they have to face that, and they can't hide anything, and they come out stronger for it. And I love the relationship between the two of them. It's like a bedrock of this book, and I think that without it, the book wouldn't work. So another main part of this book, obviously, is what happens to Yashka when she's taken to the tower. So she's kind of left on her own. The dragon is very rude, and he shouts a lot, and he's constantly calling her incompetent and stupid, and he's kind of verbally abusive, which I have kind of mixed feelings about. But it ends up coming to light that one of the reasons that he chose her was that she has an innate magical talent. And that was one of the coolest things about this book. Obviously, that's kind of a cliched idea, you know, girl discovers magical powers. However, first of all, it is the reason for her clumsiness, because like tree branches will reach out and grab at her because they want to be like near her. And also she's able to like find things. Like she's always been able to find like the last patch of blackberries that everyone thought had already been picked, but you know, it ends up that she has to like crawl through all these bushes to find it. And so she's able to sort of find her way in these wild areas. And it turns out that that was just part of her magical talent that she didn't know that she had. And the way that her magic works is really cool. And the way that it's described, where obviously the dragon is a magician, so they end up working together and they end up creating magic together, but the way that they do it is completely separate. And so they have to sort of take each other's differing viewpoints and different ways of working and fuse them together, and it makes them both stronger than they would be on their own. It's so cool. I really loved that part. So this book actually sort of took me a while to really get into. Like, it kind of starts off a little slow, and I really just wasn't sure what the drive of the book was gonna be for a long time, so I kind of like put it down when I wasn't that far into it and just kind of let it sit for a while. And so once she gets taken to the tower and it turns out that she has this magical talent, I thought, okay, the drive of the book is gonna be about her like discovering her magical ability and coming into her own power. That's part of it, but that's actually a very small part of it. It turned out that it was much more about the way that the wood has been encroaching on the towns, the force that's in the wood that's corrupted it and means that anyone that goes into the wood will be corrupted as well. Or even like one of the things that they've experienced is that in springtime, when everything is pollinating, if pollen blows into the town and into the crops, it fouls all of the food, it turns people vicious, you can't eat the crops anymore or else you'll be corrupted too. And it's this very like polluting and contagious, malevolent force. So it has to do with battling the power of the wood, and it has to do with politics with the country next door, and there's a whole lot to this book. And so once I got into it, once I got past that sort of slow start, I just raced through the rest of the book. I thought it was amazing. I genuinely think that this is one of the best books I've read this year. Like, if I end up doing a top 5 or whatever books of 2015, this is probably gonna be on it, let's be real. So you've maybe guessed by now, just from the plot synopses, what some of the common threads between the two of them are. So the biggest similarity between these two books, Darkest Part of the Forest and Uprooted, is obviously going to be the forest. And I find this whole idea of the forest as a place of danger something of an old world concept. It's not really something that's that common in literature anymore, because in most modern day life, forests have been kind of beaten back and they've been kind of sterilized. So I thought it was interesting that we get a modern day version of the forest as a place of danger, and then we get this sort of more traditional version, but in a sort of new and interesting way. So I find Darkest Part to almost in some ways be a more traditional version of the forest as a place of danger, because it's the things in the forest that are the danger. It's the fae that live there, it's the monsters that will attack you, it's the ones that use the cover of the trees and the cover of night to, you know, stalk their prey. In Uprooted, I found it to be a little bit more different, because going into the forest itself can cause you to be corrupted. It's not necessarily, there are creatures in it that are malevolent and you could even say evil, but they're not the main problem. The main problem is the forest itself. It is in and of itself malevolent and evil. So in Darkest Part of the Forest, because it's the creatures that are in the forest that are the problem, there are rules that you can follow. Stay on the path, don't thank anyone, be polite to everyone, don't give out your name, all of those kinds of things that we learn from fairy tales apply in Darkest Part of the Forest. They don't always protect you, and that's one of the driving forces of the novel, is what do you do when the rules don't protect you? And when the rules start to change, you have to fight back. In Uprooted, it's different because there are no rules. You just have to pray that it doesn't come for you. So really, in Uprooted, you are never safe. And that's partly why I used it as a book that scares you, because there were a few things in it that were just so unsettling that I was still thinking about them a few days later. So the main characters in both of these, I feel, fulfill certain fairy tale archetypes. So in The Darkest Part of the Forest, I feel that Hazel sort of fulfills this archetype of the knight, and this was very intentionally done by her. She got sort of enraptured in these stories of, you know, these stalwart brave knights, and so because her and Ben were kind of on their own, they sort of had to figure out how they were going to protect each other, and so that was what she decided to do. In Uprooted, it's more innate, but Yashka sort of falls into the archetype of the witch. So if you're familiar with fairy tale tradition, you will know that witches are often controversial, polarizing, often morally gray figures in these stories, which goes even back to just the Wizard of Oz, the are you a good witch or are you a bad witch? So they're often figures of female independence, which is very often threatening to the status quo, especially in these more traditional social situations. And so there are a lot of different ways that being a witch can go. It can be, you know, this sort of malevolent force of evil, or just the sort of old crone in the woods, but they're often given a lot of freedom in terms of where they're able to go, who they're able to speak to, what they're able to do. And so watching Yashka come into her own is really rewarding, and learning where her limits are and where she wants her limits to be rather than where they might be in terms of her ability. And watching her realize that maybe just because she has the power doesn't mean that she can use it in any way that's like petty or for her own gain, the way that she sort of has this responsibility to make things right in her hometown and with her family and with her country. So I find it interesting that Hazel is following an archetype that is usually traditionally a male one. You know, the knight is obviously usually a man, and the witch is obviously a more traditionally female archetype, but it is one of independence and power. And so in some ways I think that witch and knight are often very related. It's just that they use different tools to exert their power and their ability to protect other people. So Hazel uses a sword, Yashka uses her magic. And both of these are very much about the way that grief can sort of corrupt someone, and also the things that we do to protect the ones that we love. And the idea of going to extreme lengths to protect the one that you love is not necessarily a new one. It's in many, many, many stories, but I found that the way that they push their own boundaries to protect the people that they have deemed as family and as worth protecting played out in very similar ways. So both of these books do have romance subplots. I haven't really talked about them yet, but I probably won't really talk about them that much. I did like them. I think I liked possibly the romance in Uprooted a little bit better, but Darkest Part of the Forest was great. I loved all of the characters that were involved in their various romances, and so I appreciated them together. However, I just think the dynamic in Uprooted worked for me a little bit better, but that's more of just a sense of personal taste rather than objective quality. However, I think that that is going to be all that I'm going to talk about today. I'm trying to keep this video a little bit shorter to make up for the hellishly long video I did put up last time, but please let me know if you've read either of these. I really, really enjoyed both of them, so I'm happy to talk more about them in the comments, or you can find me on Twitter, Tumblr, etc. I'll put links down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye! Taste then of like objective ability. That's not the word I meant to use.